Maggie Chen arrived at the hospital before the sun did. She had done this for 11 years, keys in hand, shoes soft on the tile, the ward still holding its nighttime quiet like something borrowed. She liked those first minutes. Nobody needed anything yet. Nobody looked through her yet. The building was just a building, and she was just a woman with a chart in her hand and a whole shift ahead of her. She worked on Ward 7B, long-term rehabilitation. It was not the glamorous floor. It had no television cameras, no visiting politicians, no glossy magazine features about miraculous recoveries. It had 18 beds, 18 men, and the kind of slow, difficult healing that never made for good photographs. The men in 7B had given pieces of themselves to places most people only read about in newspapers. They had come back changed, and they were now learning how to live inside that change. Some were doing better than others. All of them were doing it with very little fuss, because that was the kind of men they were. Maggie moved through the ward the way water moves around stones. Quietly, without calling attention to herself, she adjusted blankets and checked monitors and refilled water cups, and asked each man not how he was doing. She knew better than that, but what he needed. It was a small difference in wording. It was an enormous difference in respect. The hospital itself was a large, busy institution that ran on paperwork and policy and the private ambitions of people who had offices on the upper floors. Maggie did not have an office. She had a locker, a medication cart with a squeaky left wheel, and a name badge she always wore facing inward, tucked against her chest, as though she were not entirely sure she deserved to announce herself. Her supervisor was a woman named Patricia, who managed the nursing staff the way a general manages an army she does not fully trust. Patricia was not cruel in any obvious way. She was cruel in the way that certain types of authority can be, through silence, through overlooking, through the small daily act of treating someone as though they are slightly less present than everyone else in the room. Patricia had worked alongside Maggie for 8 of those 11 years, and still, when important visitors came to the floor, introduced her as one of our nurses, without using her name. Maggie noticed. She always noticed. She had learned, over time, to let the noticing pass through her without settling, the way you learn to ignore the sound of a dripping tap when there is nothing to be done about it. The man in bed 7, window side, was named Raymond DeLuca. He had served 22 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment. He had 2 Purple Hearts, a combat patch from 3 separate deployments, and a lower back that had finally, in 2019, decided it was done cooperating. He was 51 years old. He was built like a man who had never once in his life done anything half-heartedly, and he watched people the way only certain people learn to watch, with the still, total attention of someone whose life had once depended on reading a room correctly. He watched Maggie, not in any unsettling way. He watched her, the way you watch someone whose work you have learned to respect. He saw how she moved. He saw the inward badge. He saw the way she made herself smaller whenever Patricia walked into the room. Not dramatically, not with any sign of self-pity, just the small, unconscious adjustment of someone who has learned that being smaller causes less trouble. He recognized that adjustment. He had seen it in young soldiers who had been broken down one too many times by the wrong kind of leadership. It was the posture of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that they did not quite belong in the space they were standing in. It bothered him more than he said, which is to say, it bothered him considerably, because Raymond DeLuca was not a man who said things easily. The complaint arrived on a Thursday. A family member of a patient on the cardiac floor had filed it. Wrong department, wrong nurse, wrong everything. But paperwork has a momentum of its own, and somehow Maggie's name ended up attached to it. Patricia called her into the hallway to tell her, not the office. The hallway, where anyone could walk past. There would be a review, Patricia said. Maggie should be aware. Maggie nodded and said she understood, and watched Patricia walk away, and then stood very still for a moment, looking at a water stain on the ceiling above her that looked, if you tilted your head slightly, like the state of Nebraska. She had noticed that water stain years ago. It had become, without her ever deciding it, the place where she sent things she could not afford to feel during working hours. The unfairness of a double shift, the sting of being spoken over in a meeting, the exhaustion that comes not from hard work, but from being made to feel, repeatedly, that your hard work is invisible. She looked at Nebraska for a long moment. Then she took a breath, straightened her badge, still facing inward, and went back to work. That night, she went home and sat at her kitchen table and ate reheated rice, and did not tell anyone about the review, because there was no one to tell who would not either minimize it or catastrophize it, and she did not have the energy for either. She went to bed early. She set her alarm for 5 in the morning. She had done this before. She would do it again. That was what you did when the institution you served could not be bothered to see you clearly. You kept showing up. You kept doing the work. You tried not to let it hollow you out. What Maggie did not know was that Raymond DeLuca had seen her come back from that hallway conversation. He had seen her face. Just for a second, before she put it away behind her professional expression. But a second was enough. He had spent 2 decades learning to read faces in a fraction of a second. He knew what he had seen, and that evening, after the dinner trays were collected and the ward settled into its particular evening rhythm, Raymond DeLuca did something he was not technically supposed to do. He got out of bed. His back made its feelings known immediately and loudly, but he overruled it, because the situation required it, and Raymond DeLuca had spent his entire adult life overruling his body when the situation required it. He went, slowly and carefully, to the next bed, and then the next. He spent the better part of 2 hours moving through Ward 7B, bed to bed, speaking quietly to each man in turn. Some of them were skeptical. 2 of them needed convincing. One of them, a young sergeant named Darnell, who had been in the ward for 3 months recovering from a serious knee operation, said immediately, without hesitation, "Tell me when." By 10 o'clock there was a plan. The following Tuesday started like every other day. Maggie arrived before the sun. She made herself a cup of coffee that she would forget to finish. She checked the overnight notes. She loaded her medication cart, the one with the squeaky left wheel, and started her rounds. She pushed the cart down the hallway toward Ward 7B and paused outside the door for just a moment, the way she always did, to collect herself. The review was still scheduled for Friday. She had not slept well. She pressed her hand briefly against the door and then pushed it open and went in. The lights were on. Every bed had its side rail raised. Every man in the ward was sitting upright, which was unusual in itself, because these were men with injuries and surgeries and long recovery roads, and sitting up was not always simple. But they were sitting up, all 18 of them, and they were looking at her. She stopped pushing the cart. Raymond DeLuca was on his feet. He was not supposed to be on his feet. His surgical notes and his physical therapist and his own lower back all agreed emphatically on this point. But he was on his feet anyway, standing beside his bed, his right hand raised to the edge of his brow. Not casually, precisely. The way a man salutes when he means it with his whole body. The others followed, not one by one, but together, as though they had rehearsed it, which, in their quiet way, they had. 18 men, some in hospital gowns, some in the rumpled pajamas of long-term patients. One of them, Thomas, bed 12, Army, both arms still healing, could not quite get his right hand all the way up and used his left instead, because the gesture mattered more than the protocol. Young Darnell had tears running down his face, with the absolute stillness of someone who has learned, through necessity, exactly how not to cry, and had lost the battle today, for good reasons. All of them were looking at her. All of them were at attention. All of them were saluting. Maggie Chen stood in the doorway of Ward 7B with her medication cart and her inward-facing badge, and her forgotten cup of coffee back at the nurse's station, and she did not know what to do. She was not military. She did not know the protocol. She was a nurse from a small town in Oregon who had spent 11 years showing up before sunrise and adjusting blankets and asking people what they needed and sending her feelings to Nebraska when the building could not be bothered to see her. She had not been prepared for this. She was not sure anyone could be prepared for this. Near the window, above Raymond DeLuca's bed, someone had taped a piece of paper to the wall. It was covering the water stain that, from this angle, looked a little like Nebraska. Written on the paper, in large, careful letters, were 3 lines. Maggie Chen Ward, 7B Ranger Standard. She read it twice. Then she looked at Raymond DeLuca, who was still at attention, right hand still raised, holding the salute with the patience of a man who had held harder things for longer. In military protocol, a salute is held until it is returned. They were holding it. All 18 of them, waiting. She raised her right hand. She put it near her face the way she had seen it done, approximately, not quite correctly, more like a question than a command. She was not military. She had not earned the gesture by any of the usual measures. But she raised her hand, and she held it there, and something moved through the room that nobody would be able to fully describe afterward. Not Raymond, and not Darnell, and not Thomas with his left-handed salute, but all of them would remember it for the rest of their lives. She dropped her hand first, because she did not know she was supposed to wait. Raymond DeLuca smiled, a small, controlled smile, the kind that cost something, and sat back down, because his back had now fully expressed its opinion of this entire undertaking. The other men settled too. The ward returned to its morning sounds. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped twice. Maggie stood there for another moment. Then she took a breath. She picked up her medication chart. She pushed the cart, squeak on the left wheel, to the first bed, and began her rounds. She gave each man what he needed. She checked temperatures, and adjusted drips, and wrote in charts and answered questions. When she got to Raymond DeLuca, she pulled his blanket up on the left side, the way he always asked, and he said, "Thank you, ma'am." And she said, "Of course, Mr. DeLuca." And it was exactly the same exchange they had every morning, and it was completely different, and neither of them said so, because neither of them needed to. When she reached the door at the end of her round, she paused. She looked down at her badge. Without entirely deciding to, she unclipped it from her pocket and turned it around so that her name faced outward. She clipped it back. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at the wall above bed 7, where the paper was still taped over the place Nebraska used to be. She left it there. The review on Friday found no evidence of wrongdoing. The complaint was dismissed. Patricia said, "Good then," and moved on to the next item in her binder. The hospital did not issue an apology, because large institutions do not often do that, and when they do, it is usually in the language of process rather than the language of people. None of that changed what had happened on a Tuesday morning in Ward 7B. What those 18 men had done was not complicated. It required no budget, no approval from the upper floors, no committee meeting, no official endorsement. It required only that they had been paying attention to the woman who pushed a squeaky cart through their ward every morning and adjusted their blankets and asked them what they needed, and that they had decided, together and quietly, that the attention she had given them deserved to be returned. Raymond DeLuca was discharged 6 weeks later. On his last morning, he stopped at the door of the ward and looked back at the bed by the window and then at Maggie, who was at the other end of the room, writing in a chart. He didn't say anything. He raised his right hand one more time, briefly, and then he walked out. She saw it. She raised hers back. Correctly, this time. She had practiced. She went back to her chart. She finished her notes. She pushed her cart, squeak on the left, to the next room. Her badge faced outward. Her name was visible. She walked into the room the way she owned it, which she did, which she always had, and which she now, finally, knew.